There is a place on Earth where the ground itself was turned into a message so vast that no human eye standing on the surface could ever read it. For nearly 2,000 years, no one knew it was there. And when it was finally discovered, no one could agree on what it meant. Tonight, we are going there. Stay until the end, because the final answer may surprise you more than the mystery itself. Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Science Guide. I am so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, I want you to take a moment. Whatever happened today, the noise, the decisions, the thoughts that kept circling back, you can set all of that down now. There is nothing left to solve tonight. The only thing you need to do is rest. Let your body grow heavy, let your breathing slow, and let your mind drift with the story. We are going somewhere very quiet tonight, somewhere ancient, somewhere that has been waiting for you patiently for 2,000 years. If you enjoy falling asleep to the deep, slow wonders of science and history, I would love for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. And before you drift off, leave a comment. Which country are you listening from tonight? Now, let us begin. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a vast, flat plain in southern Peru. The ground beneath your feet is covered in small, rust-colored stones, each one coated with a thin layer of iron oxide that has been darkening in the desert sun for millions of years. The air is dry, completely, almost impossibly dry. There is no smell of rain here, no distant clouds building on the horizon. The sky above you is the kind of clear, deep blue that only exists in places where moisture has been absent for so long that the atmosphere itself has become transparent, like looking up through a pane of pure glass. In every direction, the land stretches flat and silent. To the east, the Andes rise in a slow, steady wall of purple shadow, their peaks distant and cool. To the west, you cannot quite see the Pacific, but you know it is there. A thin, cold current pressing against the coastline, keeping temperatures mild while simultaneously ensuring that almost no rain ever falls this far inland. This is the Nazca Desert, a high plateau in the Ica region of Peru, sitting at roughly 330 meters above sea level. Not a dramatic elevation, but enough to place it above the coastal fog that sometimes drifts inward from the sea, and far below, the cold peaks of the Andes where the clouds gather and release their rain before they ever reach here. The Nazca Desert is one of the driest places on Earth. Not the very driest. That distinction belongs to the Chilean portion of the Atacama Desert to the south, where certain weather stations have gone decades, sometimes more than a century, without recording a single drop of measurable rain. The Atacama is so extreme that NASA uses it to test instruments designed for Mars. The soil in its core has been compared chemically to the surface of the red planet. But the Nazca Plateau where we are standing tonight is part of the same great system of coastal aridity that runs along the western edge of South America, a system created by the collision of two forces that have been meeting here since long before any human walked this ground. The first force is the Humboldt Current, also called the Peru Current, a river of cold water that flows northward along the coast of South America from the Southern Ocean. When warm, moisture-laden air from the Pacific drifts toward land and encounters this cold current, the air cools suddenly near the surface. Cooled air cannot hold as much moisture as warm air, so instead of releasing rain, it forms dense fog and low cloud that hangs offshore or drifts in thin veils across the coastline, but never rises high enough or stays warm enough to produce the kind of rainfall that would nourish the interior. The second force is the Andes themselves, a mountain range so tall and continuous that it acts as a wall blocking the warm, wet air that flows westward from the Amazon basin. The result is a kind of double siege. Moisture blocked from the east by mountains, moisture drained from the west by cold water, and the land caught between them has been drying for thousands, perhaps millions of years. On the Nazca Plateau, the average annual rainfall amounts to about 20 minutes of actual precipitation per year, and in some years, none at all. And this extraordinary aridity is not a recent development. The desert has been this dry, in roughly this form, for a very long time. Long enough for a thin layer of reddish-brown stones to coat the entire surface, gradually oxidizing in the air and darkening to a color the Spanish would later call colorada, the Red Plain. The formal scientific name for this plateau is the Pampa Colorada. Beneath those rust-colored stones, only 10 to 30 centimeters beneath, in most places, the soil is pale yellow, almost cream-colored, a lighter material made of clay and lime dust that has never been exposed to the same oxidizing forces as the surface layer. The two colors, the red-brown above and the cream-yellow below, exist in a sharp, clean contrast. If you were to remove the surface stones from any given area of the Pampa Colorada and pile them along the edges, the paler earth beneath would be immediately, distinctly visible, even from a great distance. Someone, a very long time ago, noticed this, but we are not quite ready for that part of the story yet. First, let us stay here a moment longer in the silence and the dark, because the night sky above the Nazca Plateau is one of the great forgotten wonders of this place. There is almost no light pollution here. The nearest city of any size is the town of Nazca itself, a quiet place of roughly 40,000 people that sits just at the plateau edge. Beyond the town lights, the desert extends for miles in every direction without a single artificial glow. On a clear night, and almost every night here is clear, the sky above the Pampa Colorada fills with stars so numerous and so bright that they seem to form a visible depth, not a flat ceiling of lights, but layers. Near stars and distant stars, and the great smear of the Milky Way arching overhead in a river of pale luminescence. The ancient people who lived here would have known this sky intimately. They would have watched it every night of their lives, tracking the movements of the sun and the moon and the planets and the stars with a familiarity that we, surrounded by our artificial light, have almost entirely lost. Standing here in the dark, on this flat, quiet plateau, with the star-packed sky above and the Andes just visible as a darker shadow to the east, you begin to understand something about this place. It is uniquely, almost perfectly suited to observation. The flatness gives you the full horizon in every direction. The dryness guarantees clear skies for most of the year. The silence and almost total absence of ambient sound makes the experience of being here feel heightened, alert, devoted. There is nothing to distract you. There is only the ground beneath your feet, the sky overhead, and the ancient, patient desert stretching away in every direction. This is where one of the strangest and most debated creations in all of human history was made. And if you were standing on the ground, right where we are standing now, you might walk directly across it without ever knowing it was there. You would feel nothing unusual beneath your feet. The lines are not raised. They are not marked with standing stones or monuments. They are simply the absence of the rust-colored surface layer. Pale corridors, geometric shapes, and enormous animal figures etched into the desert floor so subtly that at ground level they are nearly invisible. Only from the air or from the higher slopes surrounding the plateau do they become something else entirely, something that has been making people stop and stare and wonder for the better part of a century. The first time a person truly saw the Nazca Lines from above, really saw them in their full scope, it was from a small airplane in the early part of the 20th century. Commercial aviation had just begun to reach Peru, and pilots flying over the Pampa Colorada began to notice something strange beneath them. Lines, long, impossibly straight lines running across the desert floor, geometric shapes, and something that appeared unmistakably to be a very large bird drawn on the earth. One of those early pilots reportedly said that looking down at the plane felt like looking at the pages of an enormous book that he could not read. That feeling of meaning without comprehension, of a message whose language has been lost, has never quite gone away. Even now, after nearly a century of scientific study, the Nazca Lines remain one of archaeology's most gently, persistently mysterious subjects. Not because we know nothing about them, but because what we know is strange and beautiful and somehow still incomplete. Let us spend this quiet night learning what we do know, slowly, gently, the way knowledge settles best, not as a series of facts to be memorized, but as a story to be felt. The lines. And when people say the Nazca Lines, they are actually referring to a vast collection of different kinds of markings, cover an enormous area of the Pampa Colorada, hundreds of square kilometers of desert floor. Across this expanse, the ancient Nazca people and their predecessors created thousands of distinct features over a period spanning several centuries. There are hundreds of long, straight lines. Some of these lines are short, just a few meters. Others extend for kilometers across the desert floor without deviation, as straight as if they had been drawn with a ruler, which, in a manner of speaking, they were. The ancient people used simple tools, wooden stakes, cord, and careful geometric reasoning to extend the proportions of small-scale models out to desert scale. One of the longest individual straight lines on the plateau extends for nearly 20 kilometers without curving, without veering, without any visible accommodation to the slight undulations in the terrain. It simply goes straight across the desert, as if nothing in the world could be more natural. There are hundreds of geometric shapes, enormous trapezoids, those four-sided figures wider at one end than the other, as well as spirals, rectangles, triangles, and zigzag forms. Some of these geometric clearings are vast. The largest trapezoids are several hundred meters across. At their wider ends, areas large enough to fit multiple football fields side by side. They are defined by lines at their edges, their interiors cleared of the darker surface stones to expose the pale earth beneath, creating broad, pale shapes visible from altitude like enormous abstract paintings on the desert floor. And then there are the figures, the ones that catch the imagination most completely, the ones that were noticed first by the pilots and that have appeared in photographs and films ever since. There are dozens of figurative designs on the Nazca Plateau, animals, plants, and a small number of humanoid shapes. The most famous of these are the large geoglyphs drawn in the style associated with the Nazca culture. Flowing, continuous figures where a single unbroken line describes the complete outline of the form. The hummingbird is perhaps the most elegant. Its body stretches about 93 meters from beak to tail, its wings swept back in what appears to be a hovering posture. its long bill extended forward. Looking at it from above, it has the quality of a brush painting, fluid, assured, made with an economy of line that suggests deep familiarity with the subject. The spider is among the most carefully observed. At roughly 47 meters across, it depicts what appears to be a member of the genus Reiche, a rare family of arachnids found in certain tropical regions. The accuracy of the anatomical detail, the body segments, the placement of the legs, certain proportional relationships, is remarkable enough that researchers have noted it could only have been drawn by someone with detailed knowledge of that specific type of spider. Whether that knowledge came from direct observation, spiritual symbolism, or something else entirely remains an open question. The monkey is large, about 93 by 58 meters, and shows the animal curled in profile, its long spiral tail looping away from its body in a tight coil. The condor, one of the great birds of the Andes, is represented in a figure about 134 meters in length, its wings outstretched in the slow, thermal riding posture of a bird on an updraft. There is also a pelican nearly 300 meters from wingtip to wingtip, a killer whale, a dog, a lizard, its tail cut by a road built across the plateau before the full extent of the markings was understood, a heron, a series of plants and tree-like forms, and on the hillsides surrounding the plateau, rather than the flat desert floor, other figures appear, humanoid shapes with round heads and strange postures that are now believed to be older than the main Nazca period figures, belonging to the earlier Puquios culture that inhabited this region before the Nazca civilization emerged. The total combined length of all the lines, if you were to lay them end to end, would stretch for well over 1,000 kilometers. The entire system covers an area of desert floor larger than many European cities. And here is what has been stopping people in their tracks for nearly 100 years. Almost none of these figures are visible from the ground. Not really. The hummingbird, the spider, the monkey. You could walk within a few meters of their outlines and see only a low ridge of small stones or a shallow, pale corridor in the earth. You would not know you were looking at an animal. The forms only emerge when you rise above them. The surrounding low hills offer views of some of the figures, and research has confirmed that every single geoglyph can be seen from high ground somewhere near the plateau. But the full, visually coherent image of the hummingbird or the monkey requires altitude. It requires a perspective that no human being standing on the flat desert floor could consistently command. Why make something you cannot see from where you stand? This is the question that has been at the center of nearly every conversation about the Nazca Lines since the moment they were discovered. It is a question without a simple answer, as we will find when we move further into the story. But for now, let it rest with us as we continue, like a tone struck at the beginning of a piece of music that does not resolve until the very end. Before we ask why the lines were made, let us ask how. The construction method, once understood, turns out to be far less mysterious than the purpose. This is part of what makes the Nazca Lines so compelling as a scientific subject. The mechanism is clear. The human capability is established, and the strangeness of the whole enterprise resides not in some impossible technology, but in the intention behind it. The surface of the Pampa Colorada is covered in what geologists call desert pavement, a layer of stones, each typically a few centimeters in diameter, that have been sitting in place long enough to absorb a thick coat of iron oxide from the minerals in the desert air and soil. This oxidized layer, sometimes called desert varnish, is what gives the stones their distinctive reddish-brown color. It is old. The stones have been darkening in the desert air for a very long time. perhaps for many thousands of years. Beneath this surface layer, beginning anywhere from 10 to 30 centimeters down, is the paler earth, a clay and lime mixture of much lighter color. The contrast between the two is sharp and clean. When the darker surface stones are removed and set aside, the pale earth beneath is clearly visible. When viewed from above, the pale area reads as bright against the darker surrounding surface. That is the entire technique. Remove the dark stones, pile them at the edges, reveal the pale earth beneath. It sounds simple because archaeological excavations and experiments have confirmed that the geoglyphs required no advanced technology, no special tools beyond what was widely available in the ancient world, and no knowledge of mathematics beyond what any skilled craftsperson of the era would have possessed. The ancient people who made these lines would have used wooden stakes and lengths of cord to mark out the geometry, working from small models drawn on cloth or ceramics and scaling them up to full size using grid systems and proportional reasoning, techniques used by craftspeople all over the ancient world. Experiments conducted by researchers demonstrated that a team of several hundred people could construct one of the larger figures in a matter of weeks. The lines and geometric shapes could be made even more quickly. The work would have been physically demanding but straightforward, walking the planned route, picking up stones, setting them aside again and again for days or weeks or months until the pale corridor of the line stretched across the plateau and the figure emerged from the desert floor. What kept the lines from being erased by wind and rain over the centuries? The same forces that made this place so dry in the first place. Without rain, there is no water erosion. Without moisture, there are no plants growing to disturb the surface with their roots. The winds that blow across the Pampa Colorada are consistent in direction. They tend to move the fine dust along rather than scattering it onto the cleared surfaces. And the hot air that rises from the desert floor during the day creates a thermal cushion just above the surface, holding small particles aloft rather than letting them settle. The result is a kind of self-preservation. The desert itself protects the lines. They are not buried. They are not eroded. In most places, they look almost as they did when they were first made, more than 15 centuries ago. What was truly remarkable about the Nazca people was not that they could make these markings. That was within the capacity of any organized community, but that they chose to make them on this scale, over this long period of time, in this specific landscape. Understanding why they did it requires understanding who they were. The Nazca civilization emerged along the southern coast of Peru roughly 2,000 years ago, growing out of an earlier cultural tradition called the Puquios culture and developing its own distinct identity from approximately 100 BCE onward. At their peak, the Nazca people lived and farmed in the river valleys that cut through the desert, the Rio Grande de Nazca drainage and the Ica Valley, which were the only places in the region where surface water was reliable enough to support agriculture. Researchers estimate that the Nazca population, at its height, may have reached around 25,000 people, spread across a network of small villages built on terraced hillsides above the irrigated fields of the valley floors. Think about what that means for a moment. 25,000 people living in one of the driest environments on Earth. Not struggling, exactly. The Nazca clearly built a complex and sophisticated culture, but always negotiating with scarcity. Water was the central fact of life here. Not something to be taken for granted, but something to be managed, sought, preserved, and perhaps appealed to in ways that went beyond mere engineering. And the Nazca were extraordinary engineers. Their most impressive practical achievement arguably even more impressive than the geoglyphs in terms of sheer technical ingenuity, was a system of underground water channels called Puquios. These were aqueducts, not surface canals, but tunnels dug into the gravelly aquifer systems that fed the river valleys, lined with smooth river stone, and designed to carry water from the water-bearing underground layers down to where the people needed it without losing the water to evaporation in the brutal surface heat. The Puquios were not simple trenches. They were sophisticated hydraulic systems with carefully engineered slopes to maintain water flow and a series of spiral-shaped openings at the surface, the ojos, or eyes, that were oriented to catch the wind and funnel it down into the tunnels, actually using air pressure to help push the water forward through the channels. 43 Puquios were still in active use in the early part of the 21st century, delivering water to the residents of the Nazca region more than 1,500 years after their construction. Several have been modified for modern use, lined with concrete, fitted with pumps, but they remain functional. The engineering principles behind them are still working. The people who built this water system were not simple. They were people with deep knowledge of their landscape, a sophisticated understanding of water dynamics, and the organizational capacity to coordinate large numbers of workers across multiple seasons. They were farmers who grew maize, beans, squash, sweet potato, cotton, and a variety of other crops in their irrigated valley fields. They were artists whose ceramics are counted among the finest produced in pre-Columbian South America. They were weavers who created textiles of extraordinary complexity, with hundreds of colors achieved through natural dyes in patterns of remarkable geometric precision. The ceramics of the Nazca are particularly striking. They are polychrome, painted in at least 12 to 15 distinct colors, applied before firing in a technique called slip painting, which produced surfaces of vivid, permanent color. The designs on Nazca ceramics include naturalistic images of animals, plants, and people, alongside highly stylized mythological figures, beings that combine human and animal attributes, supernatural entities with enormous eyes and multiple limbs, figures that seem to represent forces of nature or divine presences rather than specific individuals. The chief deity represented on Nazca pottery is sometimes called the oculate being by modern archaeologists, a figure characterized by enormous prominent eyes, often depicted flying or hovering, associated in the imagery with water, fertility, and abundance. The same animals that appear on Nazca ceramics appear on the Pampa colorada, the hummingbird, the condor, the spider, the monkey. This is not a coincidence. The iconography of Nazca art and the iconography of the geoglyphs are part of the same symbolic system, drawing from the same cultural vocabulary of significant creatures, significant forms, significant relationships between the natural world and the world of the sacred. Whatever the lines meant, they meant it in a language that the Nazca were also speaking through their pottery, their textiles, and their rituals. The spiritual life of the Nazca was deeply bound up with the forces that governed water and growth in the desert. They were polytheistic, worshiping a pantheon of deities associated with natural phenomena: the mountains, the sea, the sky, the rain. The mountains were particularly important. The Andean peaks visible from the Nazca Plateau were not merely geographic features to the people who lived here. They were sacred beings, sources of the meltwater that filled the rivers in summer, recipients of offerings and prayers. The word for mountain deity in the Andean tradition is Apu, and the Apu were understood to control the availability of water in the valleys below, pleasing them, communicating with them, showing them reverence. These were not optional acts. They were survival strategies, as serious and as practical as any engineering work on the Puquios. The ceremonial center of the Nazca world was a place called Cahuachi, located about 20 kilometers west of the modern city of Nazca, deep in the desert near the Rio Nazca. Cahuachi was not a city in the usual sense. Archaeological excavations over several decades have revealed that it was almost entirely ceremonial, a complex of adobe pyramids, plazas, and ritual spaces that was used intensively for feasts, pilgrimages, and ceremonies, but had very few permanent residents. The pottery found at Cahuachi is overwhelmingly fine and ceremonial rather than utilitarian, suggesting that this was a place people came to for religious occasions rather than a place where daily life happened. Some of the straight lines on the plateau, when extended, appear to point in the direction of Cahuachi. The ceremonial center and the desert markings seem to have been part of the same sacred geography, connected by lines drawn across the desert the way a person might draw a connection between 2 points on a map. The Nazca people lived in this landscape, worshipped in this landscape, farmed this landscape, and marked this landscape in ways that no other culture before or since has replicated. They were extraordinary, and they were doing something on the Pampa Colorada that we are still in the process of fully understanding. The great mystery of why is the next part of our story. But first, let us rest here a moment with what we know. A people who were brilliant and practical and deeply spiritual, living at the edge of survival in one of the world's most extreme environments, making something vast and beautiful on the desert floor for reasons they understood perfectly, even if we do not. The mystery of why the Nazca Lines were made has attracted some of the most dedicated, some of the most creative, and occasionally, some of the most eccentric minds in the history of archaeological research. Over the past century, theories have multiplied like the lines themselves, each one illuminating something true about the site, and none of them fully explaining everything. Let us walk through the most serious of these ideas slowly, giving each one the space it deserves, neither dismissing them too quickly nor accepting them too completely. Because the truth, if there is a single truth here, is probably more nuanced than any individual theory allows. The first major scholarly theory belongs to Paul Kosok, an American historian who came to Peru in the early 1940s to study ancient irrigation systems. Kosok had already been thinking about the agricultural history of the region when, on a particular afternoon in June of 1941, he was standing at the end of one of the lines, watching the sunset. The date was June 22nd, one day after the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere. And as the sun descended toward the horizon, Kosok noticed that it was setting directly in line with the long axis of the line he was standing on. The alignment was not perfect, but it was close enough to set his imagination moving. Kosok called the Pampa Colorada the largest astronomy book in the world. He proposed that the lines had been designed as astronomical sighting devices, that they pointed toward the positions of the sun, moon, and stars at significant moments in the celestial calendar. If this were true, the lines would have functioned as a kind of outdoor observatory, a system for tracking the movements of celestial bodies, and therefore for marking the agricultural seasons, predicting the timing of floods, and organizing the ritual calendar of the Nazca people. This idea was taken up with extraordinary dedication by a German mathematician named Maria Reiche, who became the defining figure in Nazca research for nearly half a century. Reiche first came to the plateau in 1946 and stayed, essentially, for the rest of her life. She measured the lines. She mapped them. She protected them, at one point paying for guards out of her own pocket to keep vehicles off the desert surface. She lived simply and worked constantly, and she became so thoroughly identified with the place that she was called, affectionately and with genuine respect, the Lady of the Lines. Reiche became convinced that the Nazca Lines were indeed an astronomical calendar, a vast instrument for tracking the movements of celestial bodies and the shifting of the seasons. She believed that some of the animal figures were representations of constellations, that the hummingbird corresponded to a particular star grouping, that the spider might represent the position of the Orion constellation. She published her theories, received a National Geographic grant for her work in 1974, and devoted decades to the proposition that the lines were a sophisticated astronomical system. And then, in the late 1960s and through the 1970s, other researchers began to look more carefully at the astronomical hypothesis, and they found problems. Gerald Hawkins, an American astrophysicist who had also worked on Stonehenge, applied statistical analysis to the Nazca Lines in 1967 and concluded that there was no meaningful astronomical correlation, that the lines did not point towards significant celestial positions at rates above what you would expect from random chance. If you have hundreds of lines going in hundreds of different directions, some of them will align with the sunrise at the solstice simply by accident. Anthony Aveni, one of the founders of the field of archaeoastronomy, conducted further analysis and reached similar conclusions. The astronomical hypothesis, at least in its strong form, the idea that the lines were designed primarily as astronomical sighting devices, did not hold up under rigorous examination. This does not mean that the Nazca people had no interest in the sky. Almost certainly they did. Almost every ancient agricultural society developed sophisticated knowledge of celestial cycles, because knowing when the seasons will change is a matter of survival. The question is not whether the Nazca watched the sky, but whether the lines were specifically and primarily designed to mark what they saw. And on that question, the evidence is not convincing. So, if not primarily astronomical, then what? A second theory, developed most fully by the archaeologist Johann Reinhard in the 1980s, begins not in the sky, but in the ground, or rather, in the water beneath the ground. Reinhard brought what he called a multidisciplinary approach to the Nazca Lines, looking at the wider ecological and religious context of the region, rather than focusing narrowly on the lines themselves. What he found was that worship of mountains and water sources was not just a feature of Nazca religion, it was the dominant feature, the central organizing principle of Andean spiritual life from ancient times to the present. In the Andes, the mountains are not passive geography. They are active sacred presences, the sources of the rivers, the holders of the rain, the deities whose favor determines whether the crops will grow and the people will eat. The practice of making offerings to mountain gods, climbing to high places, leaving food, animals, precious objects, is documented across the entire Andean region and continues in many communities today. The lines of the Pampa Reinhard proposed were sacred paths leading toward these mountain deities. Walking them was a form of prayer, a physical act of devotion directed toward the sources of water that sustained life in the valley. The large geometric clearings, the trapezoids and rectangles, were sacred spaces where these rituals took place, where offerings were made, where groups gathered to petition the forces that controlled rainfall. This theory is supported by multiple lines of evidence. Ceramic fragments and other ritual objects have been found along the lines and at the edges of the cleared spaces. The lines do appear to lead toward the mountains or toward other sacred features of the landscape. The ritual interpretation fits with everything else we know about Nazca culture. Its ceramics, its ceremonial centers, its evident preoccupation with water. The theory also explains why the lines were extended and modified over time, because the ritual needs of the community changed, because different ceremonies required different spaces, because the sacred geography of the plateau was a living thing rather than a fixed monument. A third strand of interpretation focuses on the act of walking itself. Several researchers, including Reinhardt and others, have noted that many of the straight lines on the plateau lead to specific places: the edges of the plateau, the beginnings of river valleys, the locations of springs, or other water features. Some lines connect to other lines, creating networks that could be followed on foot from one place to another across the desert. The most recent research from the Yamagata University team in Japan, which has been systematically cataloging the geoglyphs using aerial photography and AI analysis, has confirmed that the smaller relief-type geoglyphs, the figures carved into hillsides and slopes rather than the flat pampa, are consistently located close to ancient trails, within viewing distance of pathways used by travelers moving between valleys. This suggests that at least some of the figures were meant to be encountered at ground level, not from above, that they were markers along routes, perhaps communicating something to people walking past. The larger animal figures on the flat pampa, by contrast, seem to be associated with the broader network of straight lines and geometric spaces, suggesting they may have served a different kind of ritual function, perhaps visible from elevated ceremony platforms or from the surrounding hills during communal gatherings. A fourth interpretation, less fully developed but intriguing, concerns the relationship between the lines and the underground water systems. The Puquios themselves, a researcher named Rosa Lasaponara, working with satellite imagery of the Nazca region, noted in 2016 that the distribution of the spiral ojos openings on the Puquios systems showed clear spatial relationships to certain features on the pampa. Some scholars have proposed that the lines may have been related to the mapping or management of subsurface water, either as markers above underground channels or as ritual markers associated with the act of accessing underground water. This idea remains controversial and has not been fully substantiated, but it points toward the deep interpenetration of the practical and the sacred in Nazca life, the Puquios and the geoglyphs existing within the same cultural logic, both expressing the central importance of water. There is also what might be called the communication theory. The idea developed partly from the Yamagata research that the geoglyphs were used as a system of landscape marking that conveyed information to people traveling through the desert. The Nazca Pampa was not empty, unused space between the valleys. People moved across it regularly, following ancient trails between settlements and ceremonial sites. Some of the figures may have served as navigational or informational markers along these routes, telling travelers where they were, what lay ahead, or what activities were performed at particular places. And then there is a fifth possibility, one that does not replace any of the others, but quietly holds space alongside them, that the purpose changed over time. The Nazca Lines were not made all at once. They were created over several centuries by multiple generations of people in changing cultural circumstances. The earliest figures, those associated with the Paracas culture, are different in style and placement from the later Nazca period geoglyphs. The geometric forms, the straight lines, the large trapezoids, these may have served different purposes at different times, may have been adapted and reused by later communities who had inherited a sacred landscape and worked within it according to their own needs. Some newer geoglyphs were drawn over older ones, suggesting that the meaning of particular spaces shifted as the centuries passed. In 2015, At the annual meeting of the Society for American Archaeology, researchers presented evidence that the purpose of the Nazca Lines had indeed changed over time, that what began as one kind of activity became another kind as the social and religious context shifted. The lines did not have a single unchanging meaning. For 1,000 years, they had meanings, plural, evolving, layered, the way any sacred site accumulates meanings over centuries of use. Perhaps the answer was never a single reason. Perhaps the Nazca Lines were all of these things at once, or different things at different times, or different things to different people within the same community. Perhaps some lines were astronomical and some were ritual pathways and some were sacred spaces for ceremony and some were markers for travelers and some were simply made because the making of them was itself the point. Because the act of coming together, of picking up stones and placing them in a line, of working for weeks to reveal the pale earth in the shape of a hummingbird or a monkey, was a form of prayer, a form of devotion, a form of collective identity that needed no further justification. This open, peaceful uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship. It is an honest acknowledgement of the complexity of human life. We build things for reasons we cannot fully articulate. We create marks on the world that mean different things to different people who encounter them. We participate in traditions whose origins we have forgotten, but whose practice still carries weight. The Nazca people were not doing something alien or incomprehensible. They were doing something deeply human, and the fact that we cannot pin it to a single explanation may itself tell us something true about how meaning works, how it accumulates, how it shifts, how it outlasts the people who first created it by millennia. Let us carry this thought with us as we turn to a question that might at first glance seem even more puzzling. If the figures are only fully visible from the air, how did the Nazca people see them? This question is often presented as one of the great enigmas of the Nazca Lines, sometimes used as an argument for theories involving balloons or elevated platforms, or in the more colorful interpretations, something rather more extraordinary. Let us look at it calmly. The surrounding hills and ridges of the Pampa Colorada provide elevated viewpoints from which many of the figures and lines are clearly visible. Research has confirmed that every single geoglyph on the plateau can be seen from ground level somewhere nearby, from a hill, from a slope, from the edge of the plateau itself. The Nazca people would have had access to all of these vantage points. They could have climbed to any of them to see their work. They could have planned the figures from these heights and directed workers on the flat surface below using signals. There is also the theory of the hot air balloon, proposed in the 1970s by a researcher named Jim Woodman, who argued that the Nazca had the materials and knowledge to construct simple balloons. He demonstrated this by building a balloon from materials available in the ancient world: fine cloth of the kind the Nazca actually made, ropes of the kind they actually used, and flying it briefly over the Pampa. The experiment worked. A balloon could be made from Nazca period materials, but no archaeological evidence for balloon use has ever been found at the site. No gondolas, no burn marks indicating launch fires, none of the material remains you would expect if balloons had been a regular feature of Nazca ritual life. The theory remains interesting, but unsubstantiated. There is another possibility that is perhaps more profound, that the Nazca people did not need to see the complete figure from above in order to make it or to use it. The figures are described by a single continuous line, which means they can be walked. A person following the line of the hummingbird would experience the figure as a path, not as an image. They would feel the turns, the curves, the spiraling lines that make up the body and the wings, without ever needing to see the whole from outside. In this understanding, the aerial perspective is not the intended viewpoint. It is a perspective the figures happen to have, perhaps intentionally, perhaps as a secondary quality. The primary experience might have been the ground level one, walking the lines, tracing the figures with your body, moving through the sacred landscape in a way that was both physical and devotional. This interpretation changes the question. Instead of asking why the Nazca made something they could not see, we might ask, what did it feel like to walk a hummingbird? What did it mean to trace the body of a monkey with your feet? To follow a spiral down into the center of a figure and back out again, in a landscape where the sky above was full of stars and the mountains on the horizon held the rain? We do not know, but the question itself feels truer to the experience of these people than any theory about runways or landing strips or astronomical calendars. It feels closer to what it might have been like to be human here, in this desert 2,000 years ago, making something that has lasted longer than any explanation of it. Now, let us move forward in time to the modern story of how the Nazca Lines were discovered and how new technology, centuries after the last Nazca person placed a stone on the desert floor, has been changing what we know. The first written record of anything resembling the Nazca Lines comes from the Spanish Conquista de León, who mentioned them in passing in his 1553 Chronicle of Peru. He described what he saw as trail markers, paths across the desert, without any apparent awareness that they formed larger patterns. In 1569, another Spanish writer named Luis Monzon mentioned ancient roads he had seen in the region. For several centuries after the Spanish conquest, the markings on the pampa were noted occasionally, but never studied systematically. They were simply there, an unremarkable feature of a landscape that Europeans had decided was largely empty and unimportant. The modern story of the Nazca Lines begins in 1927, when a Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Mejia Zespi was hiking through the foothills near the pampa and noticed, looking down from elevated ground, that the desert floor below him appeared to be marked with lines. He discussed his observations at an academic conference in Lima in 1939, the same year that commercial air traffic in the region had increased enough for pilots to begin noticing the markings routinely from their cockpits. Paul Kosok arrived in 1940 and 1941 to study the ancient irrigation systems of the region, and his observations, including the famous sunset alignment on the day after the winter solstice, drew wider international attention to the site. He published his observations and coined the phrase that stuck: the largest astronomy book in the world. Maria Reiche arrived in 1946 and began the systematic, painstaking work that would occupy the rest of her life. She measured, she mapped, she sketched. She climbed onto a ladder she carried with her across the desert to get a slightly higher vantage point when studying a figure from the ground. She lobbied the Peruvian government to take the lines seriously as a national heritage site. She paid for her own research. She lived alone in the desert for much of her adult life, and when she died in 1998, she was buried in Nazca, in the landscape she had devoted herself to for more than half a century. In 1994, UNESCO added the Nazca Lines to its World Heritage List, formally recognizing them as a site of outstanding universal value. This was not just a ceremonial designation. It meant international attention, international funding, and international pressure to protect a site that was already under threat from several directions. Then, in 2018 and the years that followed, something remarkable happened. Technology that would have been incomprehensible to Maria Reiche transformed the study of the Nazca Lines almost overnight. Drone photography, which allows detailed aerial survey at low altitude, began to reveal features that conventional aerial photography and satellite imaging had missed. Small, faint figures on hillsides and slopes, partly eroded, partly obscured by debris and visible from the ground, and difficult to distinguish from the air without the close, controllable perspective that drones provide. In 2018, Peruvian archaeologists announced the discovery of more than 50 new geoglyphs in the Nazca region using drone technology. The figures included animals, human-like forms, and geometric shapes too faint and too small to have been detected by earlier methods. But the most significant recent development has come from artificial intelligence. In 2019, and in the years following, a team led by archaeologist Masato Sakai of Yamagata University in Japan, working in collaboration with IBM Research, applied machine learning algorithms to high-resolution aerial imagery of the entire Nazca region. The AI system was trained to recognize the patterns characteristic of geoglyphs, the slight variations in color and texture that mark the edges of cleared areas, and then applied to data covering the whole plateau. The results have been extraordinary. By 22,000, the team had identified 303 previously unknown figurative geoglyphs, nearly doubling the number of known figures. The new discoveries include depictions of parrots, cats, monkeys, killer whales, and humanoid figures, as well as figures showing what appear to be severed heads, consistent with the known Nazca practice of collecting trophy heads for ritual use. The field survey to verify these AI-identified candidates required thousands of hours of walking the desert floor. The machine had found in weeks what human eyes, working from aerial photographs alone, might have taken decades to discover. What the new figures suggest, taken together with the spatial analysis of where they appear on the landscape, is a more complex picture of how the geoglyphs functioned. The smaller, relief-type figures, typically carved into hillsides and slopes rather than the flat pampa, are consistently located close to ancient walking trails and within sight of pathways. These may have functioned as markers, as way stations, as communicative signs for people traveling between settlements. The larger flat pampa figures appear to have been associated with the broader network of straight lines and geometric clearings, and may have served a different, more communal ritual function. The discovery process has not stopped. Researchers are confident that there are more geoglyphs yet to be found, and that the tools now available, drones, satellite imaging, AI analysis, will continue to reveal them. The Nazca Lines are not a fixed, fully mapped monument. They are a living archaeological site, and our understanding of them is growing. Every new figure adds something to the picture. Every new spatial relationship between geoglyphs and trails, or water features, or mountain viewpoints adds another thread to the story. The Nazca Lines are not becoming less mysterious as we learn more about them. They are becoming more complex, more layered, more human in their complexity. And perhaps that is the most appropriate outcome for a site created by people who were, in all the ways that matter, very much like us. Let us pause for a moment with the strangeness of what has just been described. A civilization that thrived more than 2,000 years ago left marks on a desert floor so subtle that they survived virtually unchanged for all that time. And we are now in the 21st century, using artificial intelligence to find the ones we missed. The Nazca people made something for their own reasons, whatever those reasons were, and those marks have outlasted their civilization, outlasted their language, outlasted almost everything about them that could be written down or remembered. The only thing that has survived in the desert air is the form itself, the pale lines in the rust-colored earth. The pale shapes of animals and geometric figures revealed by the removal of small stones. There is something quietly astonishing about that, about the way form persists when everything else disappears, about the way a decision made by a person holding a basket of stones more than 1,500 years ago, where to walk, which stone to pick up, where to put it down, can still be visible from above today, readable to a machine that processes data at speeds those stone carriers could not have imagined. We are connected to those people, not by language or memory or blood, but by the marks they made, by the simple, durable fact that they changed the surface of the ground, and the ground kept the change. There is one more way of thinking about the Nazca Lines that does not require a theory at all, and it may hold the answer we promised you at the very beginning of this story, simpler and stranger than anything the astronomers or the mystics proposed. It does not ask what they meant, or who they were for, or what cosmological system they expressed. It asks instead what it felt like to walk them. Remember that each of the large animal figures on the Pampa Colorada is drawn in a single unbroken line. The hummingbird is one continuous path beginning and ending at the same point, never crossing itself. The monkey is the same, the spider, the condor. You could follow the complete outline of any one of these figures on foot, from start to finish, without ever retracing your steps. They are not just images of animals, they are paths in the shape of animals. And this distinction changes everything when you sit with it long enough. Imagine walking the hummingbird in the early morning, when the desert air is still cool and the light falls low across the rust-colored earth. You are following a line that curves gently forward. You cannot see the full figure from where you stand, but you know the shape you are tracing because you have seen it from the hill above, because your community made it together and everyone knows its form. You feel the long arc of the wing as a gradual turn in your path. You feel the tight circle of the body as the line doubles back. You feel the extension of the beak as a long, straight walk towards something distant. You are not watching the hummingbird. You are becoming it, briefly, in the way that ritual movement makes the body a vessel for something larger than itself. This may be the closest we can come to understanding what the lines were for, not through explanation, but through the imagination of what it would have been like to move through them. The lines were walked. That much the archaeology confirms. Whatever else they were paths, and paths are made to be moved through. And movement through sacred paths is one of the oldest forms of prayer that human beings have practiced in every culture, on every continent. For as far back as the record goes, if there is a single answer to the question that has occupied researchers for nearly a century, it may be simpler than all the theories suggest. The most likely answer is this: the lines were not meant to be seen. They were meant to be walked, as ritual paths connecting communities to the mountain water sources that sustain them, as sacred geography expressing the relationship between the living and the forces that govern their survival, as a form of collective devotion that left its trace in the only medium the desert offered: the pale earth beneath the red stones, the ground itself as prayer, not runways, not astronomical calendars, not signals for any audience other than the mountains and the sky and the community walking together in the early light, a people who needed water, who revered the peaks that held it, who walked paths across the desert floor to say, in the most durable language they knew, "We are here. We are asking." Let us carry this thought forward as we turn to the modern story of how the Nazca Lines came to be known to the world beyond Peru, and how technology centuries after the last Nazca person placed a stone on the desert floor, has been changing everything we thought we understood about this place. The first written record of anything resembling the Nazca Lines comes from the Spanish conquistador Pedro Cieza de Leon, who mentioned them briefly in his 1553 Chronicle of Peru. He described what he saw as trail markers, paths across the desert, without any apparent awareness that they formed larger patterns visible only from above. He was a man on horseback passing through a landscape he did not understand, noting the surface curiosity of straight lines across desert ground and moving on. For several centuries after the Spanish conquest, the markings on the pampa were noted occasionally but never studied seriously. They were simply there, an unremarkable feature of a vast and largely empty-seeming landscape that the colonial administration had little interest in examining. The modern story begins in 1927, when a Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Mejia Gespe was hiking through the foothills near the Pampa and noticed, looking down from elevated ground, that the desert floor below him appeared to be marked with lines. He presented his observations at an archaeological congress held in Lima in 1939, the same year that commercial air traffic in the region had increased enough that pilots flying between coastal cities were beginning to notice the markings regularly from their cockpits. The two developments, ground-level academic observation and aerial commercial discovery, converged almost simultaneously, as they sometimes do when a piece of knowledge is ready to be found. Paul Kosok arrived in 1940 and 1941, initially to study the ancient irrigation systems of the coast, and his famous observations on the winter solstice sunset drew wider international attention. His description of the plateau as the largest astronomy book in the world was taken up by journalists and writers, and the Nazca Lines began to enter the wider cultural consciousness. Maria Reiche arrived in 1946, and it was her decades of systematic, patient, and solitary work, mapping, measuring, protecting, that transformed the site from an interesting anomaly into a seriously studied archaeological phenomenon. Reiche lobbied the Peruvian government persistently and ultimately successfully to take the lines seriously as a national heritage site requiring active protection. She paid for guards from her own limited funds. She wrote popular books about her findings. She gave talks and interviews. She was not just a researcher, she was an advocate, and it is largely because of her advocacy that the Nazca Lines survived the 20th century with as much of their integrity intact as they did. When she died in 1998, at the age of 95, she was buried in Nazca, in the landscape she had devoted 52 years of her life to understanding and protecting. In 1994, UNESCO formally added the Nazca Lines and the Pampas de Jumana to its World Heritage List, describing them as one of the greatest enigmas of archaeology and recognizing them as a site of outstanding universal value to humanity. This designation brought international attention, international funding, and international pressure for preservation that the Peruvian government alone had struggled to generate. It also brought a significant increase in tourism, which introduced new pressures of its own. Then, beginning in 2018 and accelerating dramatically in the years that followed, a technological revolution transformed the study of the Nazca Lines in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to Maria Reiche, working alone on the Pampa with her tape measure and her portable ladder. Drone photography proved transformative almost immediately. Drones could fly low over the desert surface, close enough to resolve detail that satellite imagery missed, hovering over hillsides and slopes that conventional aerial photography had never examined at sufficient resolution. They could cover large areas quickly and systematically, generating high-resolution photographic records of the entire plateau in a fraction of the time that ground surveys required. Using drone technology, Peruvian and international researchers announced the discovery of more than 50 new geoglyphs in the Nazca region in 2018 alone. These new figures were mostly small, mostly located on hillsides and slopes at the edges of the pampa, and mostly representing the kinds of animals and humanoid forms associated with the Paracas and early Nazca cultural traditions. They had been invisible to earlier methods, not because they were deeply buried or significantly eroded, but simply because no one had looked at those particular hillsides at sufficient resolution and from the right angle. But the most significant development came not from drones, but from artificial intelligence. Beginning in 2019, a research team led by archaeologist Masato Sakai of Yamagata University in Japan, working in collaboration with researchers from IBM, began applying machine learning algorithms to the massive archive of high-resolution aerial imagery that had been collected over the entire Nazca region. The AI system was trained on examples of known geoglyphs, learning to recognize the specific patterns of color contrast, edge definition, and spatial geometry that characterize deliberately cleared desert surfaces, and then applied systematically to image data covering hundreds of square kilometers of terrain. The results have been extraordinary by any measure. By 2022, the combined Yamagata-IBM team had identified 303 previously unknown figurative geoglyphs, a discovery that very nearly doubled the total number of known figures on the plateau. These newly identified figures include birds, fish, orcas, felines, snakes, and humanoid forms, as well as figures depicting what appear to be severed heads and trophy head imagery consistent with documented Nazca ritual practices. The team estimated that the AI-assisted method was identifying valid geoglyph candidates at approximately 16 times the rate that human researchers, working from aerial photographs alone, could manage. What would have taken decades of painstaking ground survey was accomplished in a fraction of that time. The field verification process required to confirm the AI-identified candidates was itself a massive undertaking. The Yamagata team spent thousands of person-hours walking the desert surface, checking each candidate location on foot, recording ground conditions, photographing the actual terrain. The combination of algorithmic identification and systematic human verification proved to be a powerful model for archaeological survey. Each component doing what it does best, the machine processing vast amounts of visual data quickly, and the humans making the contextual judgments that machines cannot yet reliably make. What the newly discovered figures suggest, taken together with the spatial analysis that the team has been developing over many years of fieldwork, is a more nuanced and complex picture of how the geoglyphs functioned within the Nazca landscape. The small hillside figures, mostly dating to the earlier Paracas and transitional phases, are consistently positioned close to ancient walking trails and within clear line of sight of those pathways. These figures appear to have been designed for ground-level encounter, to be seen and recognized by travelers moving through the landscape rather than from above. They may have served as landmarks, as territorial markers, as representations of deities or protective spirits associated with particular routes. The large, flat pampa figures, by contrast, the famous hummingbird, the monkey, the spider, the condor, appear to be integrated with the network of long straight lines and large geometric clearings in a way that suggests a different kind of function, one that was more communal, more ceremonial, more connected to the large-scale ritual activities associated with sites like Kawachi, The spatial relationships between these large figures and the network of lines that surround them have been a focus of ongoing analysis, and the emerging picture suggests a highly organized sacred landscape in which different types of geoglyphs served different purposes within a coherent overall system. The discovery process has not stopped, and researchers are confident it will not stop soon. The tools now available, drone imaging, satellite multispectral analysis, machine learning pattern recognition, and sophisticated ground-penetrating radar, are still being refined and applied to new areas of the plateau. Every research season brings new findings. The Nazca Lines are not a finished puzzle. They are a living archaeological site, and our understanding of them is deepening with each passing year in ways that would have seemed almost miraculous to the early researchers who studied them with nothing but their own eyes and their own feet. There is something genuinely moving about this trajectory of discovery. A civilization that flourished more than 2,000 years ago left marks on a desert floor so subtle that they could be crossed on foot without being noticed, and so durable that they survived virtually unchanged for all that time. And we are now, in the 21st century, using satellite imagery and machine learning and drone photography to find the ones we missed. The Nazca people made something for their own reasons, according to their own needs, in service of their own spiritual and cultural life. And those marks have outlasted their civilization, outlasted their language, outlasted almost every material trace of their existence. The only thing that has survived, preserved in the desert air, is the form itself. The pale lines in the rust-colored earth, the pale shapes of animals and geometric figures made by the careful removal of small stones. There is something quietly astonishing about that, about the way form persists when everything else disappears, about the way a decision made by a person holding a basket of stones more than 1,500 years ago, where to walk, which stone to pick up, where to set it down along the edge of the path, is still legible today to a machine that processes data at 1 billion operations per second. We are connected to those people not by language, not by shared memory, not by any living tradition that has continued unbroken from their time to ours. We are connected only by the marks they made, by the simple, irreducible fact that they changed the surface of the ground, and the ground kept the change, and the change has lasted long enough for us to find it and wonder at it and try, with all the tools we have, to understand what it meant. Now let us think about what it means that the Nazca Lines are still there, not metaphorically, not as a philosophical question about legacy or impermanence in the abstract. Literally, concretely, they are still there. More than 1,500 years after the last Nazca person placed the last stone on the Pampa Colorada, the lines are still visible from the air. In most places, they look almost exactly as they did when they were made. The pale corridors have not filled in with wind-blown dust. The edges of the cleared areas have not blurred significantly into the surrounding surface. The figures are still figures, recognizable animals and geometric forms, not just vague discolorations in the desert floor. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, extraordinary. We are accustomed to the idea that ancient things survive. We have pyramids, we have temples cut from living rock, we have stone monuments that have endured for millennia against every force the natural world has brought against them. But those things survive because they were built to be durable. Stone is heavy. Carved rock resists the elements. The great monuments of antiquity survive because enormous effort went into making them hard to destroy. The Nazca Lines are not like that at all. They are, in their physical substance, among the most fragile of ancient marks. a shallow scraping of the Earth's surface, a slight rearrangement of small stones that could be kicked aside by a passing foot. There is no mortar, no architecture, no engineering designed for permanence. There is only the removal of one layer of ground and the piling of it at the edges. The miracle of their survival is entirely the miracle of the climate that surrounds them. The Nazca Plateau receives virtually no rain. Rain is the primary agent of erosion in most parts of the world. Rain moves soil, carries sediment, blurs edges, fills channels, and gradually returns disturbed surfaces to their undisturbed state. On the Pampa Colorada, this process simply does not occur. The lines simply stay where they were put, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, because there is almost nothing to move them. The hot air thermal layer that develops above the desert floor during the day tends to lift dust and fine particles upward rather than depositing them within the cleared corridors. The wind that does blow across the Pampa tends to carry material above the level of the geoglyphs rather than filling them in. The result is that the environment which seems most hostile to human habitation, the driest, most barren, most extreme desert on the continent, turns out to be the best possible environment for preserving the work of human hands over very long timescales. The Nazca people may have understood this, at least intuitively, at some level below articulation. They chose this plateau for their most significant markings, not the wetter valleys, where they actually lived and farmed and raised their children. The valley soils would have quickly reclaimed any marks made in them. The Pampa would not. Perhaps they chose the desert because they knew this, or sensed this, or had seen over generations how the Pampa kept things that the valleys consumed. Perhaps the permanence of the marks was part of their sacred logic, that the desert would guard what was placed on it, that to mark the Pampa was to make something that would last beyond the span of individual lives, beyond the span of memory, beyond the span of the civilization itself. But the desert's protection, though remarkable, is not unlimited, and in recent decades, the fragility of the Nazca Lines has become increasingly and painfully apparent. The most dramatically visible single act of damage in modern times was inflicted not by erosion or weather, but by human carelessness dressed up in good intentions. In December of 2014, a team from the environmental organization Greenpeace entered the protected site near the Nazca Plateau without authorization from the Peruvian government and walked across a portion of the Pampa adjacent to the hummingbird geoglyph to stage a publicity event in conjunction with a major United Nations climate conference. They placed large yellow letters on the desert surface, spelling out a message calling for renewable energy. And their footsteps crossing the Pampa to set up and remove those letters left marks in the desert surface, marks that, given the extraordinary preservation conditions of this environment, are expected to remain visible for decades, perhaps centuries. The Peruvian government issued arrest warrants for the individuals involved. The archaeological community expressed outrage. The Greenpeace action was, in the most bitter of ironies, intended to draw attention to the climate threats facing vulnerable places around the world. And it had itself become a direct, permanent, physical threat to one of the most vulnerable ancient sites on Earth. The individuals involved apologized. The footprints remained. A more recent and in some ways more sobering threat came in January of 2018 when a commercial truck driver, apparently unaware of or indifferent to the protected status of the site, drove his vehicle off a marked road and across a portion of the flat Pampa, leaving deep tire ruts across an area roughly 30 meters wide and 100 meters long, damaging 3 geoglyphs that had survived intact for more than 1,500 years. The driver was arrested by Peruvian authorities and faced criminal charges. The damage was photographed from the air and documented in detail. The ruts are still visible in aerial imagery. These incidents, and the many smaller incursions, tourists stepping off designated viewpoint platforms, vehicles straying from marked routes, squatter settlements slowly encroaching on the edges of the protected zone, have intensified the conversation about how to protect the Nazca Lines in the long term. UNESCO and the Peruvian Ministry of Culture have been working together on updated conservation strategies, enhanced monitoring using satellite and drone surveillance, improved barrier and signage systems, and stronger enforcement mechanisms for the protected zone. The Yamagata University research team has contributed detailed vulnerability mapping, using their comprehensive aerial data to identify which areas of the plateau are most at risk from flash flooding, human encroachment, and the gradual effects of climate variability. Because climate change is a genuine concern here, even in one of the driest places on Earth. The El Niño phenomenon, the periodic warming of Central and Eastern Pacific Ocean surface temperatures that disrupts established weather patterns across South America, can bring dramatically increased rainfall to coastal Peru in years when it is particularly strong. In 1998, an unusually powerful El Niño event produced severe flooding along the Peruvian coast and brought significantly higher than normal rainfall to parts of the Nazca region. In 2009, unusual rains caused localized erosion near portions of the site. As global climate patterns shift under the influence of increasing atmospheric greenhouse gases, the frequency and intensity of strong El Niño events is expected to increase, and with it, the risk of the kind of episodic heavy rainfall that the Nazca Lines' preservation depends on not experiencing. The paradox is complete. The same global problem that the Greenpeace team came to protest is one of the genuine threats to the very site they damaged in protesting it. These threats, human carelessness, climate instability, the slow press of development and population growth in the surrounding region, are not abstractions. They are the context within which the Nazca Lines exist today, in the present tense, in the same world where you and I are living. The lines are not safely in the past. They are here, now, fragile and irreplaceable, and in need of protection from the civilization that has discovered them. What is ultimately at stake if the lines degrade beyond legibility? Not just an archaeological resource, important as that is, not just a tourist attraction, significant as that economic consideration may be for the surrounding community. What is at stake is a record of human experience that exists nowhere else. The Nazca people had no writing. They left no texts to be translated, no inscriptions to be decoded, no administrative records to be studied. What they left is this: the marks on the desert floor, the ceramics in the burial grounds, the adobe mounds at Kawachi, the underground channels of the Puquios, still carrying water. If the geoglyphs disappear, a significant portion of the evidence for what these people valued, feared, worshipped, and cared about will disappear with them. That is not recoverable. There is no second copy, no backup, no alternative source. This irreversibility, the knowledge that what is lost here is lost permanently and completely, is part of what makes the study of the Nazca Lines feel, at its best, like more than archaeology. It feels like listening carefully to someone who cannot speak any language you know, trying to understand not just what they are saying, but who they were and what their life meant to them. Every geoglyph that is documented, every spatial relationship that is mapped, every chemical analysis of the ceramic fragments found along the lines is a small act of recovery, of rescuing something from silence before the silence becomes permanent. Now, let us sit with something quieter for a moment, something that the facts and the theories and the threats can sometimes obscure. The Nazca Lines raise a question that is not really about ancient Peru. It is a question about something much closer to home, something that lives in every human being who has ever left a mark on anything. Why do we make things? Not things for use. Not the Puquios that brought water to the valley fields, not the tools, not the stored grain in the woven baskets, and the ceramic vessels that held the ordinary material of daily life. Things for meaning. Things that go beyond what is strictly necessary for biological survival. The geoglyphs on the Pampa Colorada were not necessary in any utilitarian sense. No one needed a 93-meter hummingbird scratched into the desert floor to eat, to drink, to shelter their family from the cold desert nights. The labor that went into making them, the weeks and months of organized communal effort, of walking the Pampa in the heat and picking up stones and carrying them and placing them precisely along the edge of an expanding figure, could have been directed toward other ends. It was not. It was directed toward this, toward the making of forms in the landscape that served some need that had nothing to do with survival in the narrow mechanical sense. Humans do this everywhere and always have. We draw on cave walls in the darkness of prehistoric winters. We carve faces into rocks on mountain passes. We arrange stones in circles on hilltops where no practical purpose is served. We build cathedrals to heights that no structural requirement demands. We make things too large to see fully from where we stand, too complex to be explained by any single practical purpose, too beautiful to be justified by anything other than the beauty itself and whatever need the beauty serves in us. We inscribe our presence on the world in ways that are not efficient and not necessary and not logical. And in doing so, we are being the most human we ever are. Making marks on the world is one way of saying, we were here. It is a way of transforming anonymous geography into a place that holds meaning, a place that is not just terrain, but a landscape inhabited by attention and care and the weight of human significance. It is a way of speaking to forces beyond human scale, to gods, to the sky, to the mountains, to whatever powers govern the rain and the seasons and the continuation of life in a difficult world, in a language that is not words but form, not speech but shape. There is also something in the act of making that is about the community of makers, not just the thing made. The Nazca people who organized the labor of creating the geoglyphs, who planned the figures, surveyed the lines, assigned the work, directed the process over weeks and months of collective effort, were doing something together. They were participating in a shared project that bound them to each other, to their ancestors who had made marks on this same desert before them, and to the descendants who would walk these same paths after them. The making was communal in the deepest sense. It required coordination, trust, shared purpose, and shared understanding of what was being made and why. It was, in a fundamental sense, the physical enactment of the community's identity, a way of being together that left a visible, lasting record of having been together in this place for this purpose. And then there is the question of time. The Nazca Lines have now outlasted the civilization that made them by more than 1,000 years. The people who laid the first stones of the hummingbird could not have known this would happen. They could not have known that their descendants' civilization would decline, that the valleys would be abandoned, that the rains would fail and the great Puquios would fall silent, one by one. They could not have known that 15 centuries after their work was done, a German mathematician would carry a portable ladder across the desert to look at their figures from slightly higher up, or that machines would fly above the pampa taking photographs, or that other machines would process those photographs and find figures that human eyes had missed. What they may have known, or hoped, or intended, what the choice of the desert over the valley perhaps suggests, is that what they made on the pampa would last longer than what they made anywhere else, that the desert would keep it, that it would be there long after they were not. The lines as a message cast forward into an unknown future, to be received by whoever came next, in whatever form they came. We are whoever came next, and here we are, in the quiet of a night that is also their night, under the same stars they watched, thinking about what they made and why, trying to understand people who cannot speak to us in any language, but have spoken to us nonetheless in the most durable form available to them, in the pale earth of the desert floor, in marks that have outlasted everything else about them, in a message we are still in the process of learning to read. Now, let us return, at last, to the desert at night. Let us go back to where we began, to the flat plain of the Pampa Colorada, under a sky brilliant with stars. And let ourselves be in this place one final time before the story closes. The night is very still. The stars are close, closer than they seem anywhere near a city, so numerous and so bright that the sky appears inhabited by light rather than merely scattered with it. The Milky Way arches overhead in its long river of pale fire, the same river the Nazca astronomers and farmers and priests watched turning slowly above them on nights just like this. 2,000 years ago. The Andes are a dark presence to the east, just visible as a deeper darkness against the star-filled sky. The desert air is cool now, having released the stored heat of the day back into the clear, open atmosphere. There is almost no sound. Sometimes the wind moves across the pampa, and you can hear it, a dry whisper passing low across the stones. And then silence returns, complete and ancient. Beneath your feet, invisible in this darkness, the lines are there. You cannot see them now. You need the day, and you need height to see them. But you know they are there. The pale corridors in the rust-colored earth, the spirals and trapezoids, and the long straight lines that go toward the mountains, toward Kawachi, toward the sacred geography that the Nazca people organized their world around. The hummingbird and the monkey and the spider and the condor and the pelican and all the others now being found for the first time by the patient eyes of machines, quiet under the stars, waiting with the particular patience of things that have already outlasted everything that might have erased them. They were made by people who stood where you are standing, who felt this same dry air on their skin and looked up at these same stars, who were trying to do something with the landscape that felt necessary to them in a way they may not have been able to fully articulate. They were trying to speak to something larger than themselves, to the forces that governed rain and growth and time and death, to the mountains that held the water, to the sky that held the stars and the seasons and the gods, to whoever or whatever might be paying attention from somewhere higher up than the human world. They built their water systems because they had to, because survival demanded it. They made their ceramics and their textiles because they needed vessels and clothing and beauty in their daily lives. But they made the lines because they needed to, in some other, deeper way, because a life without such making would have felt incomplete, would have felt like a failure to fully inhabit the world they had been given. The Nazca civilization declined gradually over the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era, as drought cycles and deforestation and the instability of their water systems combined to make the valleys unsustainable in the way they had been. By around 750 CE, the distinctive Nazca world had ended. The people did not disappear. Their descendants merged with other groups, carried forward what they could of their knowledge and their traditions. But the great Puquios fell quiet one by one. The pilgrimage center at Kosok was abandoned. The last geoglyphs were made on the Pampa, and then no more were made, and the desert fell into its long, patient silence. The lines remained, as they have remained ever since, through every empire and every war and every transformation of the world above them. We sometimes speak of ancient places as if they belong entirely to the past, as if the Nazca Lines are a relic of something finished, something safely behind us in history. But that is not quite right. They are still there, right now, in the desert of southern Peru, existing in the same present tense as you and I. The hummingbird is not a memory of a hummingbird. It is a hummingbird, 93 meters of pale earth, shaped like a hummingbird, present and real and unchanged, under the stars, in the same world, on the same night, while you are lying down to rest. That continuity between the ancient and the present, between the hands that place those stones and the mind that is thinking about them now, across 2,000 years of everything that has happened on this planet, it is perhaps the most sleep-worthy thought of all, that the world holds things this old and this quiet and this patient, that something made by human hands in a desert more than 15 centuries ago can reach across all that time and arrive intact in this moment, in this room, in this quiet. If you are still awake, thank you for staying with this story all the way to its end. There is something fitting about that, about following a thing through to its conclusion, the way the Nazca people followed their lines from beginning to end without lifting their feet from the path. Every story worth telling asks something of the person listening to it, even if only patience, even if only the willingness to stay a little longer in the dark with something uncertain and beautiful. You gave that tonight. And somewhere on the Pampa Colorado, under the same stars that are above you now, the pale lines are resting in the desert, unchanged, unhurried, exactly as they have been for 2,000 years, as if they always knew, in whatever way a mark in the earth can know anything, that eventually someone would lie down in the quiet and listen. The lines are still there, waiting quietly beneath the Peruvian sky. Sleep well.